Good afternoon, everyone. It's my very great privilege to introduce Alan Harvey today. For those of you who don't know him, Alan is Emeritus Professor at the University of Western Australia, and he's also an honorary Senior Research Fellow at the Perry Institute for Neurological and Translational Science. He's only very recently retired from the Scientific Advisory Board there. In his career, he's published over 250 articles and book chapters on neuroscience. And very recently, he's been focusing a lot on the development and testing of therapies to promote plasticity and regeneration, particularly in neurotrauma. And he's done a lot of that work, obviously, with me in the brain and spinal cord. In terms of sliding doors, Alan's had a very long passion for music. And thankfully for us, he decided to take that first door into neuroscience. But he has been in several bands over the years, including Gigimen, who re-released their 1970s album fairly recently, and whose surviving members played a limited number of gigs recently. But many years ago, he began writing his book, or opus magnus, as he likes to call it, Music, Evolution and the Harmony of Souls, which was published by the highly regarded Oxford Press, University Press in 2017, and reprinted back in 2018. Now, I was also happily involved in helping Alan out on many occasions, preparing his TED Talk, which is based around this work, which is also incredibly successful as well. Currently, it's 217,000, so a very successful talk. Alan's also currently a member of the Perth Symphonic Chorus and their chamber choir, and a member of the recently reformed mandolin quartet Stringy Bar. But since retirement, he's focused much more on writing and talking about the neurobiology of human musicality and these new ideas about music's evolutionary significance. And those of us who have heard Alan talk before, is one of those great speakers. For those of you who are new to his talks, this is a real privilege and it's a real treat for me to introduce Alan. Over to you, Alan. No questions.
Okay, thank you. So look, I've got quite a bit to say, as usual. Those who know me know that. Welcome to those online, especially friends and colleagues overseas. So what I want to try and quickly do today is to hash over a little bit of the ground that I've covered before, many years ago, but expand that now into some recent work that I've been doing, looking at the role of various neuromodulators and the interface between music and exercise and mental, physical health, and how that's important both for children, for their development, and also eventually for the use of music in therapeutic protocols in association with other types of therapies. So I always begin at the beginning, and one of the things I did in my book was to go all the way back to the beginning of modern humans, which is less than 100,000 years ago. And the real question that few people seem to ask was, why is it we have two communication streams? We have a universal musical language. We don't know of any cultures anywhere on the planet that don't have music and its partner dance. And it performs all sorts of important roles in terms of ceremony and ritual, and also as a carrier of information in civilizations or in cultures that don't have the written word. It is processed in a very characteristic network that I'll quickly describe. It is emotional, it drives empathy, it's arousing, reduces stress, and so on and so forth, and obviously has very close links to the motor system. If we like music, we tend to move to it, whether it be feet, fingers, or entire body movements. But we also have this other communication stream, which is what I'm doing now, language. And language is the means by which we communicate information, make plans, discuss opportunities, make choices, throw ideas around between individuals. And it is the primary means by which we convey information that we use for building bridges or whatever it might be. And it allows a communication of ideas, not just within the generation, but across generations. It is a medium which allows us to educate our children, our grandchildren, and so forth in a way that transcends normal genetic evolutionary procedures. And for most people who work in this field, the evolution of language is related to the evolution of modern thought, the modern cognitive architecture that makes up the modern mind of Homo sapiens. We're supposed to be intelligent, articulate creatures. I sometimes wonder about that, but we can have another discussion about that. So given the power of music, of language and its impact upon human evolutionary processes, the question always comes back to, so what's music for? It doesn't do any of those things that I've just discussed. And there's a lovely quote from Ian Cross at Cambridge that I always use, that music neither ploughs, sows, weaves, nor feeds. It doesn't articulate doctrine. It doesn't provide any sorts of information that's useful from one generation to the next. Yet why is it a universal? Why is music found throughout the world? I rather like that picture, actually. I've tried to play it, but it's rather difficult. Nick Bannon could do that, I'm sure. So, without going into the details of the neuroanatomy of auditory processing, suffice it to say that everything that you're hearing now and everything you hear in an orchestra or in a rock band or in any auditory context is basically transmitted via vibrations that oscillate the eardrum, then through middle ear bones into the cochlea, where, and again, without going into details, there's essentially a vibration which vibrates this membrane, the basilar membrane, in which sit a bunch of receptors, and the deformation of those receptors causes electrical signals to be passed through various channels up to the cortex, where it's primarily initially processed in what's called the primary auditory cortex, which is out on the temporal side of the brain. And if you unpick this and unwrap it, what you see is this tongue-like structure. These are transverse gyri of a person who first described them, called Heschel. That's where the primary auditory cortex sits. And this sort of flat plane here that's sitting inside this lobule is called the planum temporale. I'll come back to that later because it turns out to be rather important. The other thing I'll just mention is that because the basilar membrane varies in width from the base to the apex, that means that different vibration frequencies activate different parts of that membrane. So at the narrow end is high frequency sensitivity, and at the tip you have low frequency sensitivity, just like when you change the length of a string, you change its pitch. So there's already frequency coding at the very beginning of the transmission up to the brain. And it passes through various complex pathways through the brainstem, up through the midbrain, up to the thalamus, and then to the cortex. So there's a number of relays and a number of places where music or information, auditory information can be processed. The astonishing thing to me always is that just by the vibration of those receptors in the cochlea, we can distinguish between the sound of an oboe and a clarinet, or we can pick out the sound of one person's voice in a room of 40 people talking, just by the vibration of that eardrum and the various machinery. It's an extraordinary feat of evolution. Now, in the old days, all that we had going for us was basically pathology. People would come, a lot of work on human brain function was done after the First World War because there was a lot of head injuries, that they could look at what was lost when some part of the brain was missing. These days, fortunately, we don't have to wait for that sort of thing to happen. And the development of, first of all, EEG recording and now magnetic resonance imaging has allowed insights into how human brains process all sorts of things. And the real advance has been functional MRI, which basically works by the fact that the signals you get from oxygenated blood differ from deoxygenated blood, which allows you to see areas or imply or infer areas of the brain that are active compared to other areas. And when you do that, you can demonstrate that in music, at least in right-handers, music is primarily processed in the right hemisphere. It's not exclusively so. Language mostly in the left hemisphere in right-handers. And you can subdivide different components of music into, say, pitch, melody, and harmony, which has a right temporal lobe preference, and then aspects of rhythm and beat, are more widespread with some activity in the left, and there are clear relationships to different motor systems, basal ganglia, cerebellum, and so on. We'll also come back to the fact that you can get activity in areas of the brain known to be associated with memory and emotional responses. But, and we'll come back to this later, there are also alterations with training, which include a more bilateral representation. So if you take a plane through here and look down using a functional MRI image, this is taken from a paper about 10 years ago from Zatori's group in Montreal. This is a so-called non-musician, although I don't like that term because my view is everyone is musical, but this is someone who's not a professional musician or not highly trained. And this is for the underlying temporal regularity of a beat. You can see activity here on the right-hand side. Now this is a musician, so-called, who has activity both on the right and the left side. And I'll come back to this expansion of circuitry that's associated with musical training a little bit later on. Now, although there are clear differences, there are also clear close relationships between music and speech processing. So this paper that comes back is about 15 years old now, looks at, again, these are sort of horizontal sections from an MRI imaging, looking at areas of the brain that are active during generation of sentences or the generation of melodies, and then in light blue, those areas that were commonly activated by doing both things. And you can see that there are quite a number of areas that are active whether or not you're generating a melody or generating some speech or sentence. That shouldn't be surprising because both language and music require pitch and rhythm in the context of expression. So I can change the way I talk if I want to. I can say, what is this thing called love? What is this thing called love? And it's the same words, but different pitch, different intonation, and so on and so forth, different rhythmic emphasis. So there are common regions, and I and others have suggested that this commonality would suggest that music and language originated originally from a common precursor. Some people have called it a musi-language. Some people have called it a proto-language that was possessed by our immediate ancestors, and that during the evolution of the modern human, us, this common precursor diverged into two streams, which have to some extent evolved separately. And so the notion that we have this common element would explain why we have some circuits that are similar in both. But we should also see how different they are as well. So for example, with music, there are regions of the brain that are activated in what's called the limbic system, this complex region buried deep within the brain, which includes the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, which I'll come back to again, the amygdala, various other structures. Don't worry too much about the names if you're coming from the School of Music, but it's a complicated structure integrated within our nervous systems that processes a number of different things, including learning, memory, motivation, and emotional responsiveness. These are all key things that I'm going to come back to, and behaviors that are really driven by music in ways that are far more profound than normally happens with language. Unless, for example, you hear someone who's a great orator, and there have been great orators that you may have heard in your life, you can pick them. They make you feel really emotional. They can drive you to tears because of the way that they somehow communicate their language, but that's quite rare. So why music is not auditory cheesecake, as a famous Pinkner suggested from Boston. It's more than that. Why did we retain musicality as a universal alongside language and articulate speech? Doesn't seem to do much. And why is it, as the great Anthony Storr said many moons ago, is it a permanent part of our mental furniture? Now, there's a number of ideas put forward as to why that might be. Darwin was very much in favour of fitness, social acceptability, mate attraction, selection of mates, that it was part of you see good dancers or good musos and you fancy them. That still happens today. I suspect if you see people on stage or see people dancing. These are not mutually exclusive things, by the way. Another important aspect of this is this infant-directed communication, or what we call motherese, which is the language that a mother has with an infant before the infant learns to speak. So if you've had children, or you look at grandchildren, at age 2, 3, 4 months, they can't verbalize, but there's a lot of this highly emotive communication. You sing lullabies, there are all sorts of facial and gestural expressions. This is all part of developing infant bonding, facilitating attachment, and the emotional and social development of children prior to them being able to verbalize any language. So there are some who believe that that's really why music still exists in us, because it's, if you like, a hangover of this pre-verbal communication between the infant and the mother. I take a slightly different view, actually, and have suggested that actually when we watch or listen to a mother talking to a 2 or 3 month old infant, we're actually going back in time to how we used to talk. Everyone used to talk to each other or communicate with each other 100,000, 150,000 years ago. So it's a time channel back to the way we used to communicate before articulate speech came on board much more recently. It's also been suggested that it's an essential part, for whatever reason, words that are carried in a melodic contour, for most people, are easier to remember than just words. When I gave the TED talk, I started off by singing one of my cousin Eric Bogle's songs, and I can remember the lyrics to loads of songs, but I can remember no prose at all, as far as well, very little, except stuff I've written, I guess, hopefully. But it seems to be a carrier to enable more of a mnemonic device to remember things. And so it helps, and if you think about the indigenous populations in Australia, the use of music and dance was an important repository to carry forward the oral traditions of that group, the knowledge of their land, and so on and so forth. The other idea that's been put forward, and the one that I think is extremely important, is this notion that music is necessary because it drives cooperative behavior, group behavior that enhanced interaction, trust, altruism between individuals that had an evolutionary advantage very early on as our species was evolving in Africa. And I will provide some evidence to support this notion that one of the primary reasons why music remains a universal is it's the most precious social interaction that we have, along with dance, and is a key part of enabling or promoting cooperative pro-social interactions between modern humans. And one of the reasons I've suggested that in the book is, I guess, this has created some discussion with people who've been in touch with me, is one of the things I've suggested is that as we evolve language, what I'm doing now, and we evolve the capacity to mentally time travel, others have talked about the capacity of language to allow us to think about things in the past, we can also think about things in the future. We communicate ideas to our children and our grandchildren. We can now communicate thoughts about time in the future when we will not exist. We know we are finite. We know we are mortal. And I believe we may be the only species that as an individual knows that we as individuals are finite. And that carries with it a great deal of mental baggage. We've invented all sorts of things as to try and explain how could it possibly be that our wonderful existence is going to end into nothingness at some point in the future. And one of the suggestions I make is that actually music was a key part of providing a counterbalance or a counterweight to that new sense of mortality, of vulnerability, as a primary driver of social cooperative interaction that acted to encourage human interactions as a counterweight to this newly established sense of vulnerability and mortality. Happy to discuss that more if you wish later, if you've got time. Now, in terms of its rewarding aspects, we know that this is one of the earliest papers from Dan Levitin's group back again about 15 years ago. This is now a coronal section in this plane of an image through the brain. So it's one of this, it's this plane here. And here you can see areas, the hot areas are the areas with highest regional blood flow. And this was just an individual or listening to music compared to scrambled music. And you can see that there's various hot areas here. There's this one here called the nucleus accumbens that I'm going to come back to in a second. The orbitofrontal cortex, which is the bit of cortex that sits above the orbit of the eyes. That will keep coming up. And this was I think, a very interesting study, because prior to about the early to mid 2000s, most of the imaging studies were done by taking music apart into pitch or frequency or rhythm or melodic contour or whatever it might have been, trying to break it all down into subsections. And various people said, hang on just a minute, what's really interesting about music is it makes you feel good, it makes you happy or sad. What happens if you actually look at what the emotional responsiveness of music is as a gestalt, not breaking it down to its individual bits? And this was one of those earliest studies. And then it was followed on by some studies again from the Zatori's group in Montreal, where they played music that individuals knew, where it was known that those individuals would feel a heightened sense of emotional reward, even ecstasy at a particular moment in a piece of music. I don't know whether some of you, for me, there are pieces of classical music, for example, that every time I play that piece of music, there's always a moment where I know that climax is coming and I get all excited, and here it comes, and then it happens, and every time I go, oh, it gets me again, tears or whatever it might be. Now, what they did was to record and look at dopamine release in areas of the brain during the expectation of this climactic moment, and then when it happened. And initially, during the expectation, you got an increase in activity in the dorsal striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia here. But at the moment of that climax, if you like, you got a burst of dopamine released in the nucleus accumbens. This is the nucleus accumbens here. That is the reward center. It is an area of the brain that is activated for all sorts of situations where there's an expectation that gets fulfilled. That might be eating a bar of chocolate, listening to a piece of music, having sex, winning a gambling game, maybe hitting a good tennis shot for the winner in a game, or hitting a decent golf shot. All of those things, you'll get these dopamine hits and reward hits in nucleus accumbens. But dopamine's interesting because it's not only linked to reward, it's a link to things like goal-directed behaviors, motivation, arousal, addiction, expectation, and of course, it's critically involved in various pathways associated with movement. So in Parkinson's disease, one of the classic systems that becomes deficient is the dopamine system, and most of the treatments for Parkinsonism involve replacement of dopamine in some way. This has now been extended to studies on happiness and sadness. So again, if you image the brain, and I seem to have lost my arrow. Can anyone see? Oh, there it is. Again, if you're listening to happy versus neutral music as perceived by the listener, the nucleus accumbens again lights up. Ventral striatum here, nucleus accumbens, and some other regions. Sad versus neutral music activates different regions, including a region called hippocampus, which I'll come back to, and the amygdala, which is shown here. And the amygdala is often associated with negative emotional affect in terms of how we respond to signals. So if you put all those things together, and going back to this notion of fostering group behavior and survival strategies, one of the things I did when I was putting the book together was to look at the common areas of the brain during imaging that are activated either when listening to music that you find pleasurable or that is familiar to you, and compare that to areas of the brain that are active when a person's put into an MRI machine and performs cooperative, altruistic, or pro-social acts. So you can actually get them to play games that requires them to act empathically or altruistically or whatever it might be. And those areas of the brain that are active performing those sorts of tasks are basically overlap those areas of the brain that are active when you're listening to music that you find favorable or pleasurable. I don't think that's a coincidence. at all. That fits with the notion that one of the primary things about music is its social impact in terms of driving our feeling of well-being internally, but also driving our way that we interact with others, whether it be in dancing in time together, or playing in time together, or singing in time together. Now, we know that music also affects other systems. It affects the endorphins, the endogenous opiates, and a whole bunch of other neuromodulators that I haven't got time to go into. We know that listening to pleasurable music, or music that you find relaxing, reduces levels of the stress hormone cortisol. That's well established. It can have an impact on immune system status, inflammatory markers, blood pressure, and so on and so forth. And again, I will quickly come back to that. But the one I just want to focus on, because I wrote a review last year, which is, I guess, my recent foray into this field, was on the hormone oxytocin. Now, oxytocin, some people call it the cuddle hormone or the love drug or whatever it might be. When I did physiology, oxytocin was the hormone that was released during pregnancy, at parturition, to drive uterine contraction, to drive lactation, and that's all we knew about it. It turned out to be a really interesting peptide. It's synthesized predominantly in the hypothalamus, and it has projection to, and is released from the posterior pituitary, therefore it goes out into the bloodstream. But also there are central branches, and they distribute to about 50 different regions of the human brain. It's astonishing diversity of influence that this hormone can have. And there is a very specific receptor, the oxytocin receptor, although turns out that this receptor has a number of mutations. And those mutations can be correlated with differences in human sociability and social interactivity and empathy. There's increasing studies on that at the moment. So this receptor is kind of interesting. When oxytocin acts on the receptor, it can have direct impact on ion channels, membrane excitability, synaptic plasticity. It can change things called long-term potentiation, which is where activity increases the responsiveness of different neurons within the brain if activity continues. But even more interesting for me was it has interactions with other neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, which includes another hormone called vasopressin, the opioid receptors, which are involved in transmission of pain, cortisol, dopamine, serotonin. These are all different transmitter systems within the brain. So this single peptide has this capacity to influence a range of different systems within our nervous system. Even perhaps more interesting is that, and I didn't know this until I burrowed into this for the review last year, that there are now a range of studies showing, for example, in animals, that delivery of oxytocin reduces atherosclerosis and has a beneficial impact on cardiovascular disease. It can lower blood pressure. It has beneficial effects on immune and inflammatory systems. It can regulate appetite and dietary intake, and it has a role in maintaining glucose homeostasis. So it's being thought of as a possible treatment to assist in the treatment of diabetes. And a lot of work is now being done on this hormone because it's one of those hormones that you can actually put into a nasal spray and spray into the nose. And there are a vast number of studies. I think there's now nearly 30,000 papers on PubMed on oxytocin, increasingly going up exponentially. And a lot of those are associated with the impact of intranasal delivery on human behavior. Generally, if you spray oxytocin up the nose, to keep it short, then you get an enhancement in attachment, bonding. This probably relates to the fact that in mothers that have greater attachment to their babies seem to have high levels of oxytocin. And there's some suggestion this is related both to not only gaze that you have and the empathy that you develop with the infant, but also singing and lullabies. There's also some suggestion that's involved in that attachment, and that relates to oxytocin biology. It enhances socially reinforced learning and memory, increases emotional empathy, generosity. These are all words that are used in the literature: generosity, trust, altruism, group cooperation, collective decision-making, etc. So its actions are really to drive the way that humans interact with each other, generally in a positive way, but not always. So there are studies showing, for example, mostly in men or boys, that if they have some issues with sociability anyway, that intranasal oxytocin actually makes it worse, makes them more competitive. It's not always a positive thing. It can actually have an opposite effect. Those instances are rarer, but they're there. It also reduces anxiety and enhances the capacity to forget bad memories. I find this one very interesting. So there are in post-traumatic stress disorder, where you can have a terrifying event, a bad event that you can't forget. And there is some suggestion that by in putting oxytocin in when you're asked to recall those events, that actually makes that recall less bad. It makes it actually less harmful, and you gradually actually reduce the impact of those harmful memories. They'll come back to that as well, because some suggestion that music can do the same thing during recall. We've talked about these cardiovascular immune benefits, but there's also now a few studies, and one of the things I did in this recent review was to look in all the papers that have looked at how oxytocin is involved in musical activity. There's not many of them. There's nothing related to dance, which is important, and again I'll return to that in a couple of slides. But there are studies, for example, looking at group drumming. So there was a study in Japan looking at children who were in homes because of they had behavioural difficulties, and they had a series of boys and they got them to do group drumming. They increased sociability between those individuals, and they also showed increase in oxytocin levels in those individuals as well. There's increased oxytocin levels in some studies looking at choral singing. There's one study suggesting that intranasal oxytocin actually enhanced the interaction between a performer and the accompanist, which is, I think, interesting. And that's a relevance to some work that we do, that Gabby and I are involved with. One paper I found really interesting was a group of singers where they measured oxytocin levels in the plasma. One of the problems with oxytocin is it's very hard to measure accurately. Saliva and urine are not really good measures. Plasma is better. That's not always easy to get. And also the levels in plasma don't necessarily tell you what the levels are in the brain. So there are a whole bunch of difficulties. But the study I found interesting was these singers where there was no change in oxytocin until they started improvising. And when they got these same singers to start improvising, their oxytocin levels in the plasma went up. And the reason why I find that interesting is if any of you are musicians who've made stuff up in bands, anyone, right? It's different from reading the dots. If you just sit there and you start putting a song together or put a band together, everyone's listening to each other, everyone's working out what everyone else is doing, they're trying to get patterns together, it's all a cooperative, interactive exercise. Far different from 5 people just sitting there reading dots, because they're kind of channeling their own self at the time. They obviously have to be in time with each other, but they're not quite, in my view, as integrated. And I've talked to orchestral musicians about this, and WASO musicians, and they tend to agree, actually, that that improvisation brings a different level of sociality and sociability into music making, rather like dancing, I guess. So if you take all that together, I came up with a new diagram in this review, which not only incorporates the areas of the brain active during subjective, arousing, rewarding, emotional aspects of music, performing pro-social, cooperative, and empathic tasks, but then I linked it to where the oxytocinergic systems are, where the receptors are. And guess what? They all interact in the same regions. It's quite extraordinary how coincident that these 3 different characteristics are. Again, suggesting this coalescence between cooperative things that enhance cooperative behavior and group interaction, empathy and altruism, and social music making. Now, that's, if you like, why I think music is such a fundamental and universal experience for human beings, and it gives you perhaps a very pocket-sized idea about the anatomy and the chemistry of those drivers and how that reflects behavior between modern human beings. But it's more than that, because if you accept those arguments, then it means that it's incredibly important to think that music's a key part of human life in the 21st century. It is not an art that you do just occasionally in your spare time. It's actually a core feature of what makes human beings special, and therefore it needs to be a key part of education. This is something I've got to give a talk to the Asia Pacific Suzuki Music General Conference, this talk probably in about a month. Won't have quite so much neuroscience in it, but because it's to do with the importance of musical training in human development. We know that from studies in children that have had some musical education, there's some conflict about how much education you need, how long it has to be, and the nature of that musical experience. But overall, there's good evidence for enhanced auditory function, improved visual motor skills. Children who've had some musical training have better speech and communication skills, better language acquisition. They learn second languages more easily. They can discriminate speech in noisy environments, which was a huge flag put up by people saying that's exactly what happens in school classrooms, that you to be able to hear better. Improved reasoning and working memory. Working memory is that ability to take 2 or 3 things and then bring them in and then make a decision about what's the best strategy or the best behavioural response given those sets of circumstances. And that reflects very much on this notion of inhibitory control. This is a new thing in musical training. Children are very poor at making judgments about what's an appropriate response or not. That's what I should have had more musical training. I tend to fly off the handle a bit, don't I, boys and girls? And but inhibitory control is saying, no, that's not my immediate response. It has to be a measured response, one that's socially acceptable, one that doesn't ostracize me, one that's relevant to the situation that I'm in. And the ability to suppress that immediate dominant response seems to be enhanced by some sort of musical training. And what's interesting about that is when you read the literature, this inhibitory control is linked to academic career success, emotional well-being, physical health. Now, if that wasn't all, you'd think that some musical training would be useful. We know, in addition, given this social aspect that I keep banging on about, that music making enhances cooperative behaviour and positive social interactions between children of different religious, cultural and geographical backgrounds. So if you put kids with completely different backgrounds into a classroom and you get them to start banging drums together or making music together or singing together, they start interacting in a way that is much more positive and beneficial. Similarly, if you take strangers and put them into a choir, adults, you then assess them psychologically about how they think about other people in the choir, it's called the icebreaker effect. They start to immediately empathize and understand other people who they've been singing with in a way that shortcuts the normal ways that we would say, oh, I quite like that person, or I trust that person, or whatever. And it turns out that music training changes the structure of the brain. Now, this has been known for a long time, that musicians tend to have clear morphological differences in their brain structure from non-musicians. Again, I use the word non-musicians in inverted commas because I take the view that every human being is musical. So I guess what they mean by non-musicians is people who haven't had any significant amount of musical training. So motor cortex, the corpus callosum, which is the huge fiber bundle that connects the 2 cerebral hemispheres together, the left and the right, and auditory cortex, they've all been known to be effective. That's been known for some time. And it's been known that there's recruitment of additional circuits. So if you remember when I showed those images of non-musicians versus musicians, this is now pitch. You can see how in a non-musician, there's activity in the right hemisphere, but in the musician, you start to get activity much more bilaterally. So there's this expansion of processing, again, with this left hemisphere shift. It can go even further. So for example, we know that there's a whole bunch of, sorry about this slide, a bit complicated, but the auditory cortex has to connect to all areas of the brain associated with speech, motor systems, other perceptual systems, whether it be vision or touch, into areas of the forebrain involved in decision making and so on and so forth. And there's a dorsal and a ventral stream. The dorsal stream is sort of associated with doing something, whereas the ventral stream in general is sort of what is it, or what is that sound. Now it turns out that this is just two individuals, so it's a bit dodgy, but if you look at this fasciculus called the arcuate fasciculus here that runs from the temporal lobe up into the frontal cortex, it's actually bigger this is an instrumental musician. This is imaging from magnetic resonance imaging looking at the fiber tracts. It's bigger than it is in an age-matched individual who's a non-musician. That's one example. This paper came out 2 weeks ago in the journal Neuroscience, where they did a huge study on about 190 people comparing musicians and non-musicians. This is someone who doesn't have absolute pitch, or these are musicians versus non-musicians. And these are areas of the brain that are more connected in musicians compared to non-musicians, both on the same side. Here you can see this is essentially the arcuate fasciculus here. But look at this here. Massive interhemispheric interactions between the left and the right side in musicians that is vastly expanded compared to non-musicians. And the reasons for that, I think, are unclear. I have a naive notion. These are mostly instrumental musicians, I think, and you always use both hands, whether they're playing the piano or playing the violin or whatever you're going to be playing, the oboe, whatever. You're using two hands, and you have to coordinate those two hands all the time in a way that requires both hemispheres to be interacting in a significant way. Anyway, so we know that's all clear. There's still this question, though, as to whether those areas get bigger because of practice, or whether they had more connections in the first place. That's why people became musicians, because they had more connections from one side to the other. Therefore, they had more ability. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So I was very pleased to see this study from about 3 years ago. A Swedish group looked at 9 pairs of identical twins. So their genes are identical, but 9 of them were musical, and the others, they played the piano all their lives, and the other 9 didn't. And they imaged the brains and compared the brains of the ones that were musical versus non-musical. And lo and behold, you can, without going into details, there were clear differences. And those differences in terms of motor cortex, the corpus callosum, the temporal cortex where the auditory system is, and the cerebellum, which is motor processing region, were all different, exactly as one might have predicted. But this is clearly related to their training and their ongoing behavior, not their genes. So this is a phenomenon that's associated with musical activity, and I think that's really important. Now, I'm going to have to cut this a little bit short. From an educational point of view, that's very important, but it's also important throughout life. And this is where I want to bring in dance, because one of the things, I go to the gym now, and I always put music on the headphones and go on the treadmill or cross trainer and listen to Grateful Dead or Little Feat or Jefferson Airplane. I have to go back to my upbringing. And I can listen to music for half an hour and not notice I've been on the treadmill for half an hour, because I'm just in rhythm with the music that's driving it all the time. And of course, it turns out that as we get older, there's our capacity gets worse in terms of logic and mental functioning. The hippocampus, which is this region associated with memory in learning and recall of memory, gets smaller as we get older. That's just a natural thing, this region here. But it turns out that if you're fit and have a cardiorespiratory fitness, your hippocampus actually gets bigger. So the fitter you are in age, the bigger your hippocampus. And that relates to exercise, not stretching. So the only thing that works is exercise, not just getting up in the morning and stretching. Okay, we know that's a fact. How does that relate to activity? Well, it turns out that if you put a mouse in a treadmill and work out how fast it runs at night, or how far it runs at night, the level of this growth factor called brain-derived neurotrophic factor is higher in mice that run further. Why is that important? Well, because in humans, the more of this growth factor you have in your bloodstream, the bigger your hippocampus. Why is that important? Because the more we exercise, the more BDNF we make. We know that's a fact. And brain-derived neurotrophic factor turns out to be a chemical or a trophic factor that induces new nerve cell birth in the adult hippocampus. So we're making new neurons even now as we sit, many hundreds a day. And we know that this factor, BDNF, is important in making those new neurons. And that might be why, with activity and the increase in BDNF in that part of the brain, we actually have a bigger hippocampus, and that actually gives us improved memory function with age, which is why higher cardiorespiratory fitness is associated with increased mental and memory capacity. What is, again, just interesting about that is oxytocin, my new friend, also induces neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So if you think about that, then dancing and physical fitness associated with music has all of the right parameters to enhance cardiorespiratory fitness, cardiovascular health, memory function, mental health, and enhances our capacity to age a little bit better. So in summary, we know that music training alters brain structure. There's some evidence now that the earlier the better. Between the ages of 4 and 8 might be better than between the ages of 8 and 12. It recruits a wider set of interactive brain circuits. We know that live music is better than recorded music. Please remember that and go out and support your local musos. It provides mental stimulation. It initiates physical activity, increases cardiorespiratory fitness. It's good for nutrition, immune and cardiovascular health. And it has a lifetime of social benefit. So we know that all of these things and continuous participation in music-related social activities is related to working memory, preservation of memories, better auditory perception, and almost certainly, and just to finish, in terms of music therapy. I haven't got time to go into this now, but there's a list of the sorts of things that are now regarded as being improved by music therapy: dementia, Parkinsonism, stroke, traumatic injuries, treatment of acute and chronic pain and surgery, neonatal intensive care, tinnitus, post-traumatic stress disorder, and development conditions such as autism. All of these are now big flags for music therapists. And again, talking about my friend oxytocin, others have suggested that oxytocin is useful in autism, post-traumatic stress disorder, neonatal intensive care, chronic pain control, Parkinsonism, and Alzheimer's. So one of the things I wrote in my review is maybe we should start combining oxytocin therapy with music therapy to see if you get oh bugger, I got that wrong. To see if you get a combined benefit. I'll finish because I know that Nick Bannon's listening back in the UK, bless you. He's a big fan of Mr. Darwin. And this is a great quote from Darwin that if I had to live my life again, I'd made it a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would thus have been kept active through use. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness and may possibly be injurious to the intellect and more probably to the moral character by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature. And this is my version of Charles Darwin. Anyway, thank you for listening. Go away, dance, make music, and be happy. Thanks. Apparently I can quickly take some questions if there are any, and I have to repeat the question, so don't make it long. Yes.
Why does listening to sad music when you're sad make you happy?
Ah, that's a very good question. I don't think anyone really knows. Some people listening might have a better answer than me. This whole issue of the emotional impact of music, there have been some wonderful books written about this. Why is it that some sad music actually makes you cry, but somehow there's a cathartic element to that? It's almost a release. I think it's part of the release that you get. I mean, for me, someone like Rachmaninoff, who writes this most sad music, but it's melancholic. And melancholy is not a diminished sadness. It's a pleasure in recalling the past in a way that is somehow enriching, if you see what I mean. Hard to explain. But yeah, but it is. I mean, there's been, I say, a lot of people have worried about this, and there's really, again, music quite unique in that sense, that it can make you remember very sad events or love affairs that are broken up or whatever it might be, and yet somehow it's rewarding in experiencing that, and maybe knowing that you've progressed through that, you've absorbed that, and you've moved on, enriched from an experience that actually makes you maybe more interesting, more able to cope. I don't know. Sorry, that's just me. Yeah.
Is there buried in all that something that would help the toxic atmosphere in Parliament at the moment?
The toxic atmosphere in Parliament. Well, yeah. I did a piece for Business WA recently, and I jokingly said to the reporter, maybe every board meeting, people should get up and sing for 5 minutes before they sit down and have the board meeting. And she put that at the end of the article. It was sort of meant as a joke, but actually it's not a bad idea. I not necessarily a national anthem, but you'd have to get everyone to agree on something. That's the trouble. It's like music in the workplace. No two people will really agree on what they like best. But that's again part of the magic of music making, I think. But yeah, I mean, would it work? There are some people in Parliament I don't think would. Yeah, I know. They're missing something, aren't they? But let's not go there. Yes.
Dopamine release you were talking about earlier, that happens when you listen to a piece of music and it comes to that climactic point. Did they find that only happens to pieces that they've recognised or that they've heard before, or did that also happen with a piece that you've never heard before that does have that build-up?
Good question. So whether the dopamine release that was measured in the basal ganglion in nucleus accumbens during a climactic moment is because you know it. Those studies were because you know it. I think it can happen. Again, this is all, music is such a personal experience. I actually remember going to a concert not long ago where I heard, it was a classical concert, and there was a famous aria from Richard Strauss before, and I'd never heard it before, but I was in tears at the end of it because it was just amazing, and I didn't know it. But it does happen, but that's not quite the same, because that's, if you like, the whole experience, and then you get carried through towards the end of it. This is really to do with an expectation of something that's going to happen, and that expectation obviously can only exist if you know that it's going to be there. And that's a lot of what the nucleus accumbens seems to be about now. It's to do with the fulfilling of expectancy. And that fulfilling of expectancy is rewarding. As I said earlier, that's why I think for human movement people, it's really important, because it's like hitting a good tennis shot, hitting a good golf shot, hitting a good cricket shot. You train and train, and you have an expectation of a successful accomplishment, and doing that gives you that reward and encourages you to do it again.
I'm just trying to distinguish between music as like a learned comfort and music as it's stimulating like almost innate sort of human brain.
I think it does. I think it does both things.
Yeah.
It does both things. And remember that it has such diverse influences over a whole range of neurotransmitter and neuromodulator systems, that all of these are at play and interplaying all the time. I mean, you can pick out any of your favourites at any given moment. And again, the other point I would always stress is I never make a judgment about what someone likes in terms of music. That's their business. Growing up in the 60s in England, where we were told what sort of music we were supposed to listen to, because that was the modern music. Don't listen to that old romantic rubbish. That's old-fashioned. We were being told what we should listen to. And it's just complete. And the same happened in schools. We were kids listening to the Beatles, and all we were getting was the teacher playing 5 minutes of Vivaldi, and most of the kids in the class didn't have a clue what that was about at all. It wasn't any relevant, had no social relevance to them at all. One more?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something that you said about the use of this music precursor language for it was to do with this like newfound existential sort of threat for the deaf, talking about how. But so this is what I was quite sure when you were saying back in the day, it might help to communicate these sort of feelings between members in the.
You're saying before the evolution of articulate speech and language? Yeah, no, I mean, humans, yeah, there's good evidence, for example, Neanderthals had a lot of cooperative activities that they were capable of making. They didn't have what we have, but they had a lot of what Steve Mython calls, mimesis. They had they
ability to create sounds.
yes, and they had expressions, they had gesture, they had all sorts of things to enhance interaction and to communicate at certain levels. And clearly that's sufficient. Otherwise, a 3-month-old infant would never be able to communicate with its mum. So those non-articulate speech, non-verbal communication systems are highly refined, but they're limited. If that's all we had, we wouldn't be building bridges. We wouldn't be developing IT programs. We wouldn't having fights in Parliament actually as well, probably, which is not a bad idea. Anyway,
There's one question there from our first student.
Oh, sorry.
Who's been asked.
I'm sorry. Here, well, not much, actually. Not in our school, I don't think. There is some stuff happening in the music school. Gabby Gunders here is interested in looking at anxiety and performance, but not a lot. It's an open book. There should be more, put it that way.
That's all we have time for. Thank you very much, and can you once again congratulate and thank Alan for a great talk.